Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Messianicism with me, Eli. Today I'm going to be doing something a little. Oh, first of all, I also am joined again with my guest, uh, Little Ellie. Um, but yeah, so if I have to cut this episode short, that's why. Anyway, today I'm going to be doing something a little different from the series I've been working on, just because it's come up and in my feed, and I just wanted to respond to it. Basically, there's been this recent controversy, I guess. It's really a non-controversy, but people on the internet like to come up with a bunch of wild theories about stuff, especially in things that are not their area of expertise at all. And one such person, a couple months ago, Billy Carson, decided to go on a debate with this actual scholar. Billy Carson had been proclaiming himself and pretending to be a scholar on a variety of things. And if you are at all familiar with scholarship, the stuff that he says is a major red flag anyway. Like not even just what he says, but like how he introduces himself. And it's just really funny. But anyway, he went on this debate with Wes Huff, which was actually it was fun, exciting, a little boring. Not because the information wasn't good, but because it was kind of basic stuff and also a complete and utter annihilation. The best part of the debate, in my opinion, was after Billy Carson left and Wes Huff was um, just talking with, I think the guy's name was Mark, and they were just having a heart to heart. That was awesome. Um, but anyway, Billy Carson then proceeds to take a spiraling nosedive into the concrete for a good month, just claiming to be God and a variety of other things and really weird stuff. And my introduction to Billy Carson was actually with the Wes Huff debate, and so I thought that was fantastic. Didn't see what he was going to do next. I didn't really care. Then he decided to start a Bible study, I guess a month-ish ago, December 24th, I'm pretty sure. And I had learned about this just a couple weeks ago. And so I decided, hey, if he's doing that, maybe I'll do a quick little response to his 2 hour long Bible study, quote unquote, with this guy, Paul Wallis, who is a scholar, like an actual scholar, but also one who has some weird ideas. Just because someone's a scholar doesn't mean that they're right about things or that they have regular or legitimate ideas. In fact, a lot of times it's the other way around. But anyway, I digress there. But I just wanted to, you know, do a quick little mini series on this, and then I'll get back to my study in Romans. So let's get to it. I got that video right here. Now I'll expand myself. Whoop, just like that. And let me make sure that I'm getting share computer sound. I guess I'll do stereo. Okay. Okay, so let's get right into it.
So welcome to the first episode of Bible Study with Billy Carson and Paul Wallis. How you doing, Paul?
Good day, Billy. It's great to be with you.
Yes, man. Good day. I see we both got our spectacles on.
Yes. We were just saying it's kind of a rite of passage when that happens.
Yeah. For a long time, it's just like, oh, it's never going to happen to me. But I did receive a little cornea damage from filming on a sound stage, and the bright lights shining, lesson learned, for 16 hours a day, it gave me a little cornea damage. So now, unfortunately, I need these. Yeah.
Well, I first got specs when I was 14, when I became a bit short-sighted. But now I'm at the stage of do I want to look in the distance or read my notes? And I need two different pairs of specs for that. I haven't yet gone for the multifocals.
Yeah. I understand. So obviously, the reason why we started this podcast is because we wanted to be able to analyze deeper a lot of the ancient texts, biblical texts, and different texts from even around the world. It could be the Torah, it could be the Quran, it could be many different texts. But you being one of the foremost expert in a lot of this information, as you had been involved in the church for 33 years, I thought you would be the perfect person to do this with me and to eventually really teach me some things as well, because it's a lot of knowledge that you have in your head that I don't have in mine yet.
Well, I'm looking forward to this too, because people know me as the paleo contact guy.
Right.
Paleo contact, in case people don't know, is the theory that in the deep past, our ancestors had contact experiences with other civilizations. But my route into that has been through my studies of the Bible, 33 years in church-based ministry. I was a theological educator, training pastors in hermeneutics, which is the principles of interpreting ancient texts.
Right.
And it was really that work that got me into this field. And I was absolutely...
So as a Messianic, you run into this not that infrequently. Like every 2-bit iconoclastic guy who has a death grip on sola scriptura can get into this pretty easily, especially if you read like some of the Ezekiel stuff early on, and Genesis 6. And I think I was 14 when I first heard somebody talking about Ezekiel as like look at it, there's wheels inside of wheels. You know what that looks like? It's a UFO. And I went down that rabbit trail for a little while when I was 21, and came away just thinking, it's probably not true. It's a phase that you kind of have to grow out of, and it seems like this guy Paul Wallis has not grown out of it. And we'll talk a little bit about like the evidences in this mini series for and against the whole alien encounter stuff. But basically, the two schools are, well, one school takes these texts to be extremely literal. Like Ezekiel isn't seeing a vision. He is watching the heavens open and the clouds part and a rift is opened in the fabric of space-time and these entities come down or whatever. Whereas he could also just be seeing a vision. Maybe he's seeing a real vision into the spiritual world, but that's not the same thing as aliens. And Genesis 6, maybe you take this very literally and you say, well, yeah, angels came down and started procreating with women, and that is, angels are actually aliens, which is kind of an interesting callback to Christian fundamentalism that considers considers aliens to just be demons. The circle meets the two extremes of the circle meet at some points. But you could also just say this is mythical prehistory genre. Like they were writing as mythical prehistory. Yeah, we'll get into that, but just basically the literary analysis of some of this stuff a little bit more. This first episode of this podcast, which presumably there will be more episodes, seem to be much more of an introduction to some of these concepts. And so that's what we'll be talking about just on an introductory level.
Absolutely sold out on the traditional mainstream Orthodox view of the Bible. I was an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. That's one down from a bishop. And so my life was really wedded to a particular way of reading the Bible. But through now, 40 years of preaching from it and 15 years of training pastors to study it, It has forced me to engage with those texts at a deeper level and to see things in the text that actually don't fit with our conventional tellings.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. You know, I'm not an expert in biblical text, and I don't pretend to be. I make, statements or theories or ideas.
And there's the obligatory pause right there, just because, well, he has claimed to be, and since being, since his nosedive, he has some forced humility now.
Ideas about what I've seen and what I perceive to understand in text and a lot of the religious texts, and comparing it to a lot of the ancient texts. One thing that I found, and you can tell me if I'm on the right or wrong path, is I found that there seems to be a lot of incredible parallels between ancient text and biblical text. I see stories kind of being extremely similar in certain areas where it seems as if, since these ancient texts were a little bit older than the biblical text, it seems as if some of it was somehow copied or rewritten or reinterpreted and put into some of the newer text.
Well, this is something that every pastor learns when they go to seminary or theological college. I did my theology degree at the University of Nottingham.
First of all, yeah, that's kind of, every pastor. Like, I went to a very conservative seminary for my bachelor's, and it was like the books that you had to read for that, even that, were very, well, you delve into the comparative literary criticism or whatever that you want to call it, and you just anyone with an internet connection can go figure this stuff out, and it's kind of required reading now to be a pastor. Well, to be a trained pastor, I should say. But I kind of like the subtle jab there, where Billy Carson's like, yeah, you just got to go deeper, and you want to you take the standard reading, but then you read all of these other texts and you realize, what is this? There's copying or borrowing or whatever. And then Paul Wallis is like, yeah, every pastor knows this anyway.
And you were confronted with the fact that the Bible has sources, that the biblical writers have had other sources before them, which they have used in some fashion to shape the familiar stories of, well, we take them as stories of God, but I argue not all of them are. The stories of the Elohim and the stories of Yahweh, some of those are a retelling of Mesopotamia.
So, a quick spoiler, Paul Wallis is a straight up Marcionite. And he talks about this near the end. I see right in this area, abolishing the Old Testament laws and New Testament discontinuity and stuff like that, near the end of the episode. But yeah, so Marcion originally, well, not Marcion, I guess, the Gnostics in general, so Valentinus, Marcion, and all those guys, they made a sharp disconnect between creation and God, because creation is bad, God is good. Physicality bad, spirituality good. And of course, there's kind of like a hard problem of consciousness there, which not exactly the problem of consciousness, but the idea of like, if consciousness is real and if physicality is real, how do those two connect to each other? And that's what the hard problem of consciousness is. There's a bit of a precursor to that in this spirituality, physicality, Neoplatonism that was going on in those days. If God is good and creation is bad, then how did a good God create creation? And the way that the Gnostics solved this problem is actually there are these eons, and Irenaeus talks about 32. Origin, I think it was, talked about like some of them have 32, some of them have 30, some started with 4, and some have like up to 50. Because Gnosticism wasn't really a straight up school. It was a bunch of different people with a bunch of different opinions, and very chaotic. But what they did to solve this problem was say, well, the good God created a being that was also good, but less good, more imperfect. And then that being created another being, which was also more imperfect. And that being created another being, also more imperfect. All the way down to 32, which would have been the creator God, which, was the God of the Old Testament, because the God of the Old Testament is the one that created the world. And that creator God was evil, actually. It wasn't good, or it wasn't less good than the primary God. The creator God was evil. And so we see evidence of this when you look at the Old Testament. God is doing a bunch of evil things, Elohim or Yahweh. They're doing all these evil things. And so, therefore, we need to say that that was an evil God. And how do we know that he was doing all these evil things? Well, look at Jesus. Jesus is good. And Jesus says, don't do all those evil things. And, never mind Revelation, never mind his own words in at certain points. But Jesus was good. And so obviously his words were corrupted. So we have to dispense with Matthew because he talks about some Jewish stuff in there, and the Jews are worshipers of the evil God. We have to dispense with Mark because that's also a little too Jewish. Luke is okay at most points, but Luke was also corrupted, so we got to cut out some of the Luke stuff. John is really Jewish, but also John has a couple proof texts that we can use, so maybe a couple of them. The letters of Paul. Paul was very against Judaism, so he's okay. But John, Jude, the book of Hebrews, Peter, all bad. And so Marcion actually had this really truncated canon of scripture, and some argue that he was the first one to produce a canon, but that's disputed because at this point, well, first of all, we don't actually have all the writings from this period, so there could be some that we're just not aware of. Um, Also, it's not clear if written texts were seen as more authoritative than just straight up oral tradition, especially if you're coming at this from a Christian Jewish perspective, which the first century of Christianity was more or less Jewish Christian. So it's not clear that Marcion had the first canon, but it is clear that he was probably one of the earliest guys to actually write down a canon, like a full canon. But of course, it was a truncated canon because he thought that uh, the Old Testament God was evil. But you're going to see this in Paul Wallis's philosophy. He thinks that the Old Testament God is evil, and so therefore you need to take Elohim or Yahweh and say that they were just that Old Testament God. And, you know, that's not God. That's not who we worship. That's not who Jesus worshiped. Jesus worshiped this guy named Theos rather than Elohim. Elohim was the Hebrew God. Theos is the philosophical Greek God, but better than the philosophical. It's okay. It's just, let's keep going.
Mesopotamian story. Now, Christians didn't know this until the 1800s. And it was only after we found the translation key, the Behistun inscription, that allowed us to read the ancient cuneiforms from out of ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria, began recognizing stories that they already knew from the Bible. And so it was Assyriologists like George Smith writing in 1876 and Nathaniel Schmidt writing in 1896, who started pointing out these parallels and the very high probability that the Mesopotamian texts were the sources. And if you get hold of an academic Bible, an extended study edition.
So it's true that the Sumerian ideas there were more recent discoveries. it's not true that that's the first time Christians ever ran into that. Actually, if you read or listen to audiobooks of the church fathers, especially the apologists, they'll talk about how there are similarities between Christianity and some of these pagan beliefs. Not because these pagan beliefs are like sources of Christianity, but because paganism gets things right sometimes. And Clement of Alexandria actually has a wonderful quote. If I can get it right, it's something like the true philosophy, and I don't mean Platonism or Epicureanism or Aristotelianism or Stoicism, but all of them, or all of the good bits of each of them, are philosophy. And then each strand has added to the good philosophy its own particular um, degenerations. And and this is in his Stromata, chapter 7. He he introduces this idea. Clement of Alexandria was one of the first ones to introduce this idea, but he wasn't the only one. Origen talks about it as well. Justin Martyr talks about it. Like it was not an uncommon belief. And especially when you're in Alexandria, you have Philo of Alexandria, who very clearly was taking Stoicism and appropriating Stoic philosophy into Jewish belief. So this was not new. And the what they dealt with was where do these similarities come from? And the idea that they came up with was basically like God prepared the Hebrews with the Old Testament, and God prepared the pagans with their philosophy, the Greeks with their philosophy in a very similar way. And this is Clement of Alexandria's position. And the idea there is that God was working among the pagans in order to bring them to truth. And the pagans, they did corrupt it in the same way that the Jews corrupted it. Um, and, Clement of Alexandria was thinking that the Jews corrupted it far more than I think the Jews corrupted it. But it's that same sort of idea. And so it's sort of a false dichotomy to say that you have to only have Christian writings or you have to only have Christian writings that took from other sources, and therefore the Christian writings are actually pagan writings. It's a false dichotomy. The true way of thinking about this is the way that I think about it, so therefore it's true, is that God, if he were to speak to me right now, he'd speak English. He'd probably speak English in a way that I'd be familiar with. He'd probably use scientific concepts. He'd probably speak to me or you in a way I would understand. In the same way, he spoke the language of every culture that he reveals himself to. So if the ancient Hebrews coming out of Egypt were steeped in this, and there's this great course on Audible, Ancient History by Brian something. I forgot his last name, but it's great. But he talks about how the Israelites probably came into the ancient Egypt along with the Hyksos, and that the Hyksos were a group of people that were there for a few centuries. And although we don't have written record of their existence, it's actually fairly clear with the physical evidence that they brought with them like Phoenician stuff, which also comes or is also related to the ancient Sumerians in a sort of like long distance relation in a way, but they also brought in Grecian stuff. They were far more willing to integrate and mingle different philosophies to create like a chimera in a way of philosophy. And this is one of the things that the Egyptians hated, which is why they wanted to get rid of them. And they settled in the Delta. But the Israelites probably had migrated alongside these Hyksos, and when they were enslaved, they were then uh, taken captive in this same area. And then when they left, they probably had a very good mingling of cultural ideas. And if God is coming to reveal himself to them, he's not like it's a fundamentally wrong way of thinking about it to think that God would just come in and say, okay, I need to correct every little single nitpicky thing that you believe. So instead of the flood, I'm going to say it's this other thing. Instead of this or that, I'm just going to correct everything. It's not what God did. He corrected the things that he needed to in a very minimalistic way, but he spoke their language. So when he spoke their language, what did they have? Well, they had this idea of this massive flood. So he used it. Instead of Utnapishtim, who received immortality, he's not some quasi deified demigod. He's just a guy, just a guy named Noah, and he had his own fallings. Instead of the first humans who were designed to be slaves out of the demonic blood of Tiamat and her son, what was that guy's name? Um, Kingu. Instead of those guys, humans were created out of the dust of the earth and given the image of God, and all of humans were. And so humans weren't created to be slaves, they were created to have dominion. So, like, you have all these things where God is inserting himself into their culture and rewriting what needs to be rewritten. But at the same time, these stories came down to the people of Israel for a reason. It's not like these stories were just made up out of thin air. The if you there's a study of mythic literature that's really important that people get wrong. They fundamentally misunderstand mythic literature, and I mean, I understand why myth sounds like not fact, just because we live in this very post-Enlightenment physicalist sort of straight historical world, which is very weird. It's a very weird time to live in, just in the grand scheme of human history. But let's say if you read like Mircea Eliade's book, he goes into how these myths develop and why they developed. His book, History of Religious Thought, or I have this other book here. It's called Oral Tradition as History, and it also goes into like how do these myths develop, and the way that these myths develop is that they become essentially truncated history. It's like you take 1,000 years of human like interactions with each other and with God, and you truncate it down to a single paragraph. And then for the next 1,000 years, that paragraph is reworked and rewritten until it reaches this crystallized state of essentially perfection. Um, so when God begins revealing himself to Moses, first of all, it's amazing that he did that to Moses and gave Moses the Torah as opposed to what was the earliest, like someone from 10,000 years earlier who was just beginning to start farming or whatever. There's been like 10,000 years of development of these truncated myths. And oh, more than that, actually. I think Mircea Eliade goes back to, if I remember right, like 150,000 years. But like, if we assume that you have 150,000 years of mythical development, you have a lot of time for these myths to become truncated and be like crystallized. And the Sumerian mythologies are the result of that. And so the Sumerian mythology isn't just, oh, one time this thing literally happened long ago. The Sumerian mythologies are how, for the last 100,000 years, have we has it been the most effective in our daily life to think about the human condition? Well, the most effective way to think about the human condition, according to the ancient Sumerians, is to think about you can't really get immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Um, the gods, they're kind of just like us in a way, but a bit more powerful. And you can trick them. They can go to sleep. You can kill them as well, but we can't because we're simply their products. The Epic of Atrahasis, we were made just to work the field. And if you work the field, you'll be happy. If you don't, then you'll be miserable. Why? Well, because the gods designed it like that. That's that's how these myths developed. And what does God do? The real God comes into this end of 100,000 years of mythical development and says, okay, um, you have been working on this philosophy for a long time. I'm not just going to rewrite this. I'm just going to tweak it and say, you know Hava, Eve. Hava is the Hebrew for Eve. She's not a goddess. She's not the bringer of wisdom in the way that you think she is. In fact, she brought a deadly wisdom. She is the mother of all living, but it is her folly to think that she is a god or that she is the consort of the god. And so we're going to start there. And that's sort of what God does. He doesn't like he speaks their language, I think is the main point that I'm trying to get at. And so it's a mistake to think that, oh, just because he's speaking their language and we have this philosophy of post hoc ergo propter hoc, like what Billy Carson just outlined. Just because we have this philosophy now, therefore, they were their sources, and God isn't actually God, but he's actually Marduk or whatever. That's just straight up baloney, and it's coming from a false metaphysic of God. And you don't even get this from the Bible. So like there's another book, Who Wrote the Bible, which basically goes into the documentary hypothesis and source criticism, and essentially tears it down. And it says that the problem with a lot of this is these stories, first of all, you can't really draw a straight delineation between one source or another source. Just because one source uses Elohim versus Yahweh versus Ha Elohim or whatever, it's possible that they're just different genres, and different genres have different conventions, and uh, and so you can't draw that straight delineation. Also, you can't say that let's say you did get some sort of redaction. You can't date that to 400 BC in the Babylonian exile. That's impossible to do. And at the same time, you can't uh, say that, oh, here's what's the name? The religion, the Religions of Ancient Israel, I think is the book by what's the guy's name? Yehezkel Kaufman. He says, just going off of this source criticism nonsense, he says that you can't say that there is any sort of nucleus or primitive biblical text that was polytheistic. There's no evidence at any single word in scripture that indicates that it had a polytheistic precursor. Like either the redactors were so thorough with their removal of polytheism that like you can't even find a single ounce of evidence for it, or like actual evidence. These guys are going to go into like pseudo evidence that doesn't actually work, but either they were so thorough, or as Yehezkel Kaufman puts it, they're just vastly different philosophies, and one cannot develop from the other. And so this is legitimately its own set of myths and stories. You can't say that this set of myths stemmed from another one because monotheism is fundamentally different from polytheism. There is no comparison between the two, and one cannot develop from the other. And that's true. First of all, there's never been a case in history um, where monotheism developed from polytheism. And like you can't point to one. You can point to certain people who have entirely circumvented their systems in order to promote a monotheism. I think of like Plato and Socrates or Akhenaten or something like that. But they circumvented their system. They didn't develop their system from their polytheism. And the fascinating thing about Akhenaten, for instance, he was very much like a Socratic figure, is his Atum was, well, no, his Aten. Yeah, no, Aten. Ah, having a difficult, his Aten. I'm pretty sure it was Aten. Yeah, his Aten was miles apart from any of their polytheistic traditional gods. It was so different and so revolutionary that he had to flee Egypt, at least the capital, and go into the desert so that he can start a new cult area, um, a cult city. And it was immediately rejected by his son, who went back to Egypt. So like you get flash in the pan sort of things like that, but they're not developments of the polytheistic religion. Uh, they're entire circumventions of the polytheistic system, and they are what do you call it? They're revolutions, not evolutions, I should say. So you can't evolve into another one. But anyway, source criticism, it's a legitimate practice and study, but you need to do it under its proper conventions. Anyway,
Oh,
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 I'm gonna pause right there and let's possibly come back. Okay, we're back. Um, so yeah, I think I basically beat that horse. So let's continue.
Of the New Jerusalem Bible, for instance, they're very open about this source dependence. So we learn about this at university. We learn about this when we study theology. But then the question comes, well, what does that mean? What's the significance of that? And there are scholars who said, oh, well, clearly the biblical writers were aware of the Anuna of Sumeria, the Anunnaki of Babylonia. They knew these stories. They have summarized them. But
So it's not actually, let me make sure I'm getting close enough. It's not actually a necessary conclusion that they were aware of those documents. The conclusion, I mean, you can have a variety of reasons why one source would make it into another source. And well, there's my favorite reason, which is they are Carl Jung's collective unconscious, which is the idea that certain stories and texts and whatnot are just kind of bound to spring up in human thought. And so it's just kind of a strange phenomena phenomena where like there's this idea that mushrooms pop up in just human thought, and trees pop up in human thought, and mountains, and all of these have like this sacred value in a way. And it's just like a psychological truth where mountains, trees, and these other things have sacred value to humans. And there are possibly evolutionary reasons for that, and there are possibly other reasons for that. But that, like, you can just have this straight up collective unconscious explanation. There's also development of tradition. You can say that the Enuma Elish and the Genesis, I guess, certain parts of Genesis 1 and Genesis, the second creation myth, which is actually Genesis 2 through 9, essentially. You can say that certain parts of both of those uh, and the Enuma Elish stem from the same tradition. And so there was a earlier tradition that branched off into these different explanations. Or you can just say that these sections in Genesis, they stemmed from that um, uh, similar tradition ancestor, and God changed them. It's like there are so many different ways to say that, or to explain the phenomena that you receive, or that we see when two sources look similar. You don't have to have borrowing or taking from or any sort of idea like that. It's yeah. Well, let's continue.
Scholar like Michael Heiser would say they've inverted the stories. They know the stories, they've given another version, but they've given a little twist because they're teaching something new. But there are problems with that. And one problem is, are you going to base a true story, something that's going to be claimed as divine revelation, on a false story? What?
So that's not really, again, that's a false dichotomy in a way. Going back to the Clement of Alexandria example, those philosophies aren't false. They have false elements, but they also have true elements. And you can take the true, because everything of value is inherently Christian. You can take the true and, oh, 1 second. Okay, I'm back, and I do not remember what I was saying, so I am going to continue. Wait, can I just go back? Where am I? I'm gonna go back 10 seconds if I can do that. Yeah. Okay.
With that. And one problem is, are you going to base a true story,
Oh, yeah.
something that's going to be claimed as divine revelation, on a false story?
So like I was saying, this is just a false dichotomy. Going back to the Clement of Alexandria quote, there are true things in like every religion. Otherwise, it wouldn't be bought into. You wouldn't be able to get mass appeal if it didn't actually contain like some sort of nucleus of truth. And so that's why a true Christian religion will be able to appropriate those things and utilize them in your own philosophy or view of the world. And this is just going back to the earliest days of Christianity. They did this, like I said, Origen, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Philo of Alexandria, like the Alexandrian school in general. Not only that, but it goes back to pre-Christian history with the Jews, Second Temple Judaism. Like one of the big schools was the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were they were like the guys that did that in a conservative way. You had the Sadducees, which did that in a very liberal way, and the Pharisees who did that in a very conservative way, where you would have the Pharisees would see an idea in Greek philosophy, and sometimes they would say, that's a good idea. Sometimes they would say, no, it's not a good idea. And they would be able to incorporate that into their interpretation of the law and just philosophy in general. And so it's a false dichotomy to say, oh, well, just because something is an untrue story, therefore God is going to entirely dismiss it. But like I said before, God spoke the language of the people in his day or in those days. And otherwise he wouldn't be understood. It wouldn't be able to be called revelation. And that's how Christianity has historically viewed it. Now, of course, there have also been historically Christian, let's say, groupings that entirely moved away from that. Like there have always been fundamentalists, and then there have always been scholastics. There's always been that sort of those two schools of thought, or those two extremes of how you handle Christianity. And same thing in Judaism. So like there's always been that. So he he's presenting this as if those are the only two options, but they're not. They're just not. And he's going to use this to tee up his own position. Like the first hour and when does that start? First essentially hour and 37 minutes is him teeing up his position where he can say, actually, the New Testament God is not the real God. The real God is Theos versus Elohim. And it's a silly position, but let's continue.
What is the logic of that?
Mm.
And I find, and I argue for this in my books, particularly the Eden Conspiracy and Escaping from Eden, that when we find the summary forms in Genesis 1, Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 11, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, all those would be examples of where the biblical writers have summarized a Mesopotamian story. There's no inversion. There's no twist to it. Only the names of the characters have been changed.
And there's a massive inversion, actually, and this is what Michael Heiser talks about. There's a demythologization that goes on, where instead of Nimrod being Ninurtu, like this hunting deity or whatever, he's just a guy. He's just a king that got a little too big for his britches, and God judged him. So the massive again, there's you cannot develop monotheism from polytheism. It's never been done before, and there's no theoretical basis on or mechanism for how you can do that. And so it's just false. You can't do that. The other thing about this, I had another thing, but it just escaped my mind. So I'm just going to continue.
You're given a shorter form. And some of the correlations are very detailed and very close. And the Noah story is probably a great example of that, where the Artrahasis story talks about the releasing of a number of birds to confirm that the flood is receding, and Noah releases one bird.
Yeah.
In the story of the flood, across all the cultural tellings of that story,
he gets that backwards. The Atrahasis story actually releases one bird, and then Noah releases three. But then again, you do have those details, but the question is, are those worldview details, or are those semantic details? And they're just factual detail. Like 1 versus 3 is really interesting. Like they both send out birds. That's really interesting. What does that tell you about the deity and how the deity deals with the person? Maybe it's in there. It's not obvious. And I'm sure there have been commentaries on Genesis that have dealt with that, but it's not the sort of thing that you can say is a lack of an inversion, because it's not clear that there is something needing to be inverted there. Like what's the necessary inversion there? Like there isn't one. So what is the evidence that he's trying to bring this up for? Like it doesn't prove anything. So let's continue.
Story in Mesopotamia and into the biblical story, there's only a 4% variance of the volume of that escape vessel given from all the measurements that are in those texts. So the dependence is very...
So that's an interesting thing. And again, what do the measurements tell us about the deity and how the deity talks to us? There have been studies that have, well, not studies, papers, I guess, that have been like sort of tried to find the temple language in the story of Noah's Ark. And it is true, the pagan temples and the Israelite temples in those days, like the tent temple that that the Canaanites had, because the Canaanites by and large had nomadic tent temples. Some of the cities had more physical temples, but they were much smaller than the counterparts in Egypt or in Samaria and Babylon and Assyria. But they're just different. And so there is a lot of similarity between the two temples. What does that tell us about the deity? It's nothing. It tells us that God saw that those temples were a good indication or a good metaphor for how God talks to mankind. He saw that that was a good tool for producing a sacred space. What's the inversion, or what's the thing that needs to be inverted? Nothing. There's nothing that needs to be inverted there. So that's not evidence for his point. It's evidence, potentially, that there is a shared heritage between the people who God was talking to when he had Moses give them Genesis and their neighbors. That's all.
Very clear.
Yeah.
And the question I ask in my books is, what are the implications of acknowledging that the Bible's Elohim stories are a retelling of the Sumerian Anunnaki stories? And the Eden series really follows the logic of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going through the Enuma Elish and really combing through it up and down, inside and out. And then I saw just a lot of similarities between the Enuma Elish and the Genesis story. And I was just like blown away that these correlations or these similarities were so extreme. And if I don't know if you were going to go into that today, but I did have a little bit of a breakdown that I wanted to go over.
Sure. Yes, feel free. One that struck me on my most recent reading is there are even names that correlate. Asherah in the Bible is Asheri in the Enuma Elish, and they are...
Wait a second. So God is telling the Israelites not to worship Asherah, and that pagan deity corresponds to a pagan deity? What? That's crazy. Mind blown. I guess I'm wrong about everything. So you're telling me that when God commands them to stop talking about Marduk or any of those other deities, that those deities, their names correspond to other deities? That's crazy. What? I'm blown away. I don't know. I'm at a loss for words. I'm just gonna keep playing it though. So, yeah, because so my mind's blown. I'm a convert.
Credited with exactly the same things. So I think you're on the money there, Billy.
Wait a second. When God tells the Israelites to not worship Asherah, and there's a Sumerian Asherah, that those two Asherahs are credited with the same thing, it just keeps getting deeper and deeper. I don't know what to say.
Yeah. Even Marduk is, or depending on how you want to pronounce it, Marduk or Marduk, he's in the ancient Sumerian tablets, specifically even in the Enuma Elish, but he's also in the Torah and he's also in the Bible. So we see this name carried over.
Now that's one I don't think I've actually seen God say Marduk or some place say Marduk. I wouldn't be surprised if it did happen. But still, I would be curious to know like his citations on that.
From even much more ancient text that goes back thousands of years, which is pretty interesting.
Yes, it is interesting. And see, all those things are...
Okay. Here's another fallacy that they're running into. Just because something is more ancient doesn't make it the source. And how do we know this? Well, we actually have a good example in Egypt. Um, so the Memphite creation myth, you can find it. It's basically the most straightforward enumeration of the Egyptian creation myth from like the period that it was written in, but most scholars, and I get my information from that Brian guy from the Great Courses, so forgive me if I'm wrong there, but my understanding is most scholars view this Memphite creation myth as a retelling of something that goes essentially in its every component back to the earliest points of Egyptian history where they had mythology. Um, but the writing that we have of the Memphite creation myth is, I think it's from the 7th century. Like that's when we know that this myth was written down. So here's the question. It is very similar to Genesis 1. Basically the first, I think, 5 verses of Genesis 1. So if that's the case, did the Egyptians get their creation myth from Genesis? Mind blown. The Egyptians are actually appropriating the Jewish creation myth. What? Well, that's not how these two guys would see it. These two guys would see it as the other way around. How do we know? Well, because the Memphite creation myth is pagan, and therefore, if it's pagan, then it goes back further. And I mean, it is true that most scholars view the Memphite creation myth as being basically an articulation of what people would have believed at the time, even though before this myth was written down, we don't actually have evidence of it being articulated in this way. We do have evidence of the components being articulated in scattered writings and stuff in Egypt. But I suppose if that's the evidence, then we should view the Memphite creation myth as being as having its source in Genesis, as just being a retelling of the Genesis story. You can't have that though. Why? Well, because that's not how they view it. So that doesn't work. But it just goes to it just belies the fact that that very simplistic like first order level of analysis is not the be all end all. And yeah, it does have some merit and some weight in terms of like the overall way of looking at things, but that's not how our analysis or our criticism of this work actually plays out. I'll use another example. Um, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh, as we have it today, I think we have 4 copies, and the most ancient ones are highly broken. We don't have the full stories, but the fullest Epic of Gilgamesh that we do have is I think the newest one, and the newest one has a really interesting thing going on with it. It has segments of Semitic poetry and then segments of Greek prose. Like it's not in Greek, but the prose are the style of the Greeks. And so the question is, how did that happen? Were they originally writing in Greek prose? No, because this story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was highly edited and has been edited throughout the centuries. And we don't actually know exactly what the original looked like. And there's a really good possibility that what we do have has been influenced by other cultures. It's not like that is the source of all the other cultures' stuff. It's been influenced by other cultures. But you're gonna look at that and let's say you use the Epic of Gilgamesh as a source for the Genesis material, are you then going to say that Greek prose entered into the Genesis material? Or are you going to have to dissect the Epic of Gilgamesh? Well, that's not how they think about this, though, because the story is much more complex, and the source criticism and all that sort of stuff gets way deeper than just this one was earlier, therefore it was a source of this other one. That is a logical fallacy, by the way, post hoc ergo propter hoc, like I mentioned before. But it's just a very simplistic way of looking at this, and it's not how actual scholars like view this source criticism.
Were being spotted back in the 1800s. So it's known at an academic level. Pastors come across this information while they're being trained, doing their theological degrees and their higher degrees. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, information doesn't filter down into the rank and file of the churches. So when you start speaking about this publicly, it comes as a huge shock to a lot of mainstream Christians, and you get a lot of pushback from it. And very often I say to people who are giving me pushback, well, go and talk to your theological faculty, get into a locked room with your pastor and ask about what he learned at theological college, and you may be surprised at how much of what I'm talking about is known at that level.
Right.
Okay, the problem here is, the stuff you're using as evidence is known, but the conclusions are very not known. The conclusions are actually most people disagree with. And so this false equivalency of the data and the conclusion, it's very common to do in academia today. But, news flash for everyone out there, data doesn't come with its own interpretive mechanism. Data doesn't come with a canonical interpretation. You actually need to use a philosophical system in order to interpret data. And so what he's doing is he's coming at this with his philosophical Marcionism and then interpreting the data in that way. And then it's a bit of a bait and switch there. He says, well, look at this data, therefore my Marcionism. Whereas that's not how it works. You can look at the data, and most people do look at the data in a very level-headed way and says, oh, no, it doesn't prove that at all. And so, go talk to your theological faculty, go look at what the actual scholars say. I can almost guarantee you that they're not going to look at the data and then say, aliens, I knew it. All along, it was the aliens. That's not how it works. Sorry. So let's keep going.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, you went through the full process. So if anybody would know, you would know, especially after being involved in the church for 33 years, which is incredible. Just a couple of similarities I wanted to break down that I was able to just find. And this is so easy to do. I think anyone can really now. You can buy the Enuma Elish on Amazon, or you can even download it online pretty much for free. And then, of course, most people already have a Bible. So I think they can kind of go through these. But just a few areas that I saw, for example, primordial chaos and the unformed earth. In the Enuma Elish, tablet 1, lines 1 through 5, when on high, the heaven had not been named. Firm ground below had not been called by name. Naught but primordial Apsu, their begetter, Mumu, Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. And then if you really analyze that and look into Genesis 1, verses 1 through, chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So if you look at the comparisons there, in the Enuma Elish, creation begins with a formless, watery chaos in the Apsu, fresh water, Tiamat, which was salt water, and commingled in the unstructured state. No heaven or earth.
So, okay, there's a bit of a similarity there. What's the point of the similarity? In the Genesis story, the waters are not gods. The chaos is not gods. The salt water, the fresh water, they're not gods. There's a big difference there. Massive difference. And that's the point of well, I mean, you could say that's one of the primary points of God's usage of the language in Genesis 1. There are a lot of other points as well. But like, what are you trying to prove here? It's not evidence for what you're trying to prove, just so you know. And also, it doesn't prove aliens.
Earth yet existed by name. And in Genesis, the initial state is similarly undefined. The earth is without form and void, and there is a deep covered in darkness with divine presence hovering over the waters.
Yes.
And so it's credible.
Yes, the parallels are extremely close. So both narratives.
So actually, no, the parallels here, there are a couple other really big differences. So in many cultures in the ancient world, in order to do magic, you had to know the name of the thing that you're trying to do magic on. This is true, for instance, in the Egyptian culture. I couldn't guarantee that it's also true in the Sumerian culture, so, fact check me on this one. But if you don't know the name, if it doesn't have a name or it's not called by name, that's not saying that it is formless in chaos. What it's saying is the god can't control it. Because here's another big metaphysical difference between these pagan stories and the true story of God. The gods, they don't control things directly. They control things through magic. And that's a very big difference. Magic is its own separate thing. Magic is like this other primordial, like pre-existent entity that it doesn't have personhood. And so the gods actually, they sort of come from this magic, or let's say the primordial waters comes from this magic, and then the gods spring from that, and then there are these generations. But in order for the gods to actually control things magically, they have to use magic to do it. And then in order to do that, you had to know the name of the thing that you're trying to cast a spell on. So it's not the case that they didn't the waters were not called by name is the same thing as they were formless and void. They're formless and void just means God hasn't formed them yet, but it doesn't say anything about God's impotence in forming them. Whereas they were not called by name was saying in that culture that the gods are impotent in forming them. And in order for them to be formed, they had to be given names like Tiamat, like all those other things. And then once they were given a name, they were given not only a name, but also personhood. And so they became gods in a way. So very, very different metaphysical claims here between the two stories. Are there some sort of like a couple of semantic similarities? Sure. The metaphysical similarities are not there, though. They're just not there. You could say they're both chaos, okay? And so chaos is not a god. And that's what Genesis says. Chaos also is not outside of the domain of God's control, which is also what Genesis says. So you have to do better than that in order to say that one is just sourced or is what's the academic sin when you I guess just copy without reference. I forgot the name of that. But when you just copy without reference, like it's not the same thing. You have to do more to prove that at the very least.
Begin with the need to separate.
Also, it doesn't prove aliens.
The waters, so fresh water from salt water.
Yes.
And I argue this is actually a story of rehabilitation. It's not a creation narrative. It's the rehabilitation of a devastated planet. And the Hebrew phrase for chaos is tohu wa bohu, which implies that there was order, but something has happened and now it's in chaos. It's been devastated.
Yeah.
And then.
So that is what some scholars think. It's not the necessary implication, though. So that is, again, going back to the point of data doesn't come with its own interpretation. Uh, Tohu Bohu, of course, does mean like formless and void, chaotic. It's more specifically like a desert state. It's entirely useless in the minds of the Israelites. But when you got the Septuagint, they I don't remember the words that they used, but they sort of, by that time, it was viewed more as like this metaphysical chaos. So, but that does not imply that creation was in order and then became chaos. That's not the implication. It just doesn't say anything about that. And that is what, from my understanding, the scholarship does generally see this worldview as it does imply chaos and like maybe not necessarily the beginning of creation, but that doesn't imply that it was in order and then got destroyed. Like you can't draw that implication just from the words alone. You have to again insert your philosophy into it in order to come to that conclusion.
The idea that the heavens appear, again, I argue it's not that the heavens are created, it's that the heavens cannot be seen, that
Correct.
There's a pall of dust and ash and soot in the atmosphere.
No, the heavens were created. So Marcionism, Gnosticism, this is where it's starting to appear. Heavens weren't created by this creator God. This creator God only took what was already there and started working with it, because this creator God is evil and he can't really create the world. The heavens and the earth were actually created, or the earth was created by this creator God. The heavens themselves were created by something better. And that's this early indication of Marcionism that he's talking about, and he'll talk more about it later in the video.
Atmosphere which has to be cleared. And this picture of darkness and flooding and chaos that has to be returned to order, water separated, land separated from water, is not just in these two narratives. You can hear it in the Iroquois story of beginnings. Yeah. You can hear it in the Filipino story of beginnings. Mm-hmm. You can hear it in the Popol Vuh, the Mayan story of beginnings. And so it always catches my interest when there is sort of external corroboration of details, and especially if they are mind-boggling, unlikely sounding details, but repeating from culture to culture. And it suggests...
What's unlikely about thinking that at one time the world was chaotic and now it's in order? That's not an unlikely thing. And again, going back to the mechanisms for that sort of distribution of a belief, there are lots of mechanisms. Collective unconscious, hey, that's calling us.
There's this shared bed of cultural memory that's expressing itself through all these traditions. Yeah,
absolutely. You're so right with that. I mean, just the concept of a primordial watery abyss found in both texts, while in Hebrew, we know that Tehom is deep and linguistically is derived from Tiamat. So the conceptual resemblance is really striking, that both function as chaotic waters before creation. So it's just, like you said, the story has...
Big difference. One is a god, one is not a god. Big difference. You can't derive monotheism from polytheism. And also, it doesn't prove aliens.
Been repeated all around the world in several indigenous cultures, which is just uncanny. You almost have to say, well, it's not a coincidence anymore.
Exactly. Yes, and that was what first caught my...
Here's another one, and this goes back to when I was doing the Christmas debate. If a bunch of philosophies that center around trees spring up, there are two ways you can think about that. One, they all derived from one primordial philosophy about trees that branched out, and they're sharing with each other, and they're all based in paganism or whatnot. Or a lot of people deal with trees, and trees are a good source of sustenance, and so therefore it's a natural thing for people to actually view in this elevated way. Just maybe. A lot of people, they view chaos as bad and order as good. So maybe before the world was created, it was chaotic and bad, and then God made it good. Just maybe.
Attention.
Mhm.
I'd like to go back to an even more basic question and ask how you first encountered the Bible
Mhm.
and what your beliefs about the Bible were when you first encountered it and how that shifted. And then I'll share my own journey.
Sure, definitely. That's a great question. So I found the Bible as a young child. When I was very young, my father saw that I had an aptitude for reading, and fortunately for me, he started making me do a lot of book reports at a very.
I'm going to skip this part because it's not really relevant to our what we're doing. You can go watch it if you want. But basically, long story short, both of them were not believers, and then they became believers, and then became strong believer. Billy Carson, I don't think he was ever like he didn't actually become a believer. It's been like a couple days since I listened to this, so I could be wrong. But eventually, they started becoming disillusioned by reading extra stuff, and then they decided to move away from being a Christian because of their own personal beliefs and stuff and whatnot. So I'm gonna skip this part, and you can go listen to it if you want.
Answers, answers, decision to follow Jesus. And what happened to me happens with a lot of people. You have a powerful spiritual experience, and then you say, oh, okay, these guys are obviously on the right track. What do you all believe?
Mhm.
And so my start point was simply to listen to what they believed about the Bible and think, well, they must be right because, there are genuine spiritual experiences happening in their church community, except it didn't all add up.
Mm.
And I had questions. Why do we treat the Bible as if it sort of came down in a bubble when clearly there's a story to it? It's evolved. It was written by different people. Why do we?
If you if you viewed the Bible in that way, then yeah, there's a very good chance you're going to be disillusioned because that's not how God inspired the Bible. So you should probably not view the Bible in that way. It's a faulty way of viewing the Bible. It didn't just come down like on gold tablets or whatnot, and and came with its own already pre-programmed translation into the other languages of the world or whatnot. That's not how it works, and that's not how revelation in general works. So yeah, that's definitely more of a fundamentalist way of looking at it, and it's understandable why when you view that as the Christian way, and then you find out that it's not really like that, that you would reject the Christian way in general, as opposed to just rejecting your fundamentalism for a more nuanced Christianity. I will be right back.